Welcome to Codename Madeleine with Arthur J. Magida. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today and for traveling through various meetings to get here. I'm so pleased to welcome Arthur. We've been talking about doing a program together about Noor Khan for some time. He is the author of Codename Madeleine, a Sufi spy in Nazi-occupied Paris. In addition to writing this and other books, he's been a visiting professor of journalism at Georgetown and a professor of writing at the University of Baltimore, a consultant to several PBS documentaries and to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, a columnist for BeliefNet, and a contributing correspondent to PBS's Religion and Ethics, Newsweekly, editorial director of Jewish Lights Publishing, senior editor of the Baltimore Jewish Times, and an environmental reporter for National Journal. So I know we're going to have a very fascinating and very well-rounded view of Noor Khan today with his background and knowledge. But before I turn this over to Arthur, I wanted to share a little bit of how Noor Khan appears at the Spy Museum. We have a dedicated space in our World War II gallery that focuses on Noor. She is such an approachable figure that we decided when we were developing this space to have some interpretive hands-on objects here. And I had the pleasure of coming up with some of these. There's a chance for people to find out just how heavy the radio is that she carried, and Arthur will, I know, talk more about that. A chance to see if you could have passed a tea test. That's drinking tea the proper way. And then this piece, which I have a very sweet photo of a young girl at a youth education program. These are jackets, and you are tasked with trying to figure out which one would be appropriate for Noor to wear undercover in Paris, the one made in London or the one made in Paris. So we really, really feel like we can put people a little bit into her shoes with some of these interactive objects. And then she has made such a big impression on the staff at the Spy Museum and to our guests. Frequently, they cite learning about her as one of the most meaningful people that they meet at the museum. And I myself, I promise, Arthur, I'm turning it over to you in just a minute, but I had the pleasure just last month of finally getting to see her memorial in London, which is right near the British Museum. And I truly felt like I was making a pilgrimage. She's been such an inspiration, and we all feel so connected with her. But you have uncovered so much more about her history. I'm anxious to hear it. And I just want to tell our guests, if you have questions, pop them into the Q&A or into the chat. I'll be looking at them, and at the end, we'll come back and ask some of those. Okay, Arthur, over to you, dear sir.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I really appreciate that. And I'm also touched that a moment ago, you used the word pilgrimage when referring to your visit to that statue of Noor in Gordon Square in London. Indeed, this entire journey that I've made with Noor, not alongside of Noor, not looking at her from a distance, but with her, almost hand in hand, has felt like a pilgrimage to me. Anyway, Amanda, thank you very much for arranging this. Thank you, everybody on the sidelines, staff at the museum. Thank you, museum itself. And thank you, everybody out there in Zoom land, whoever and wherever you may be. I'm going to identify that woman on the screen in just a moment. First, I want to say it's a true honor for me to discuss Noor Inayat Khan, the subject of my book, Codename Madeleine. Noor, I believe, was among the most unique of all World War II spies, maybe unique of all spies in all wars. She's little known, although thanks to the museum, she's better known. She's surprisingly brave. She's always faithful to her core principles of truth, love, service. And she embodied a very admirable way of relating to the world, a way that we would do well to emulate today. In fact, just as many of us are weary or apprehensive or scared or just plain bummed out, this is a really tough world we're living in. Noor was also tired and apprehensive and scared, and hers was a scarier and more frightening world than ours. And yet, Noor never retreated. She always conducted herself with the utmost integrity, and she never lost her conviction that the world could be a better place and that she somehow could help guide it there in some small way. But before we wade into any of that, and we will, I promise, who was Noor Inayat Khan? Once upon a time, there was a princess, a Sufi, which is a mysticism commonly associated with Islam. She was named Noor Inayat Khan, a young woman who saw the world crumbling around her and tried to heal it. Noor was a true global citizen. Her mother, Ora, who we've seen on the screen for a few moments now, was an American who first lived in Arizona, New Mexico, then in New York with her brother. And Noor's father, next slide, please. Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan. He's about to pop up, I believe. Hazrat Inayat Khan, next photo. Through whom Noor inherited her regal lines. Was not, there's Noor's father, Hazrat. He was not only an Indian, but also the man who introduced Sufism to the West when he came here in 1910. And Noor herself was born in Moscow in 1914. Next slide. Noor was born Moscow, 1914. There she is with her father. She was raised in London for a few years, and then in what was essentially a spiritual cocoon in Saran, a small village directly opposite Paris. A moment ago, I said once upon a time. I assure you, I was not being flippant. Between her father being Indian royalty, her family living in what was almost a castle on a hilltop opposite one of the grandest cities in the world, Paris, and the happiness of Noor's childhood, eventually darkened by the forces of evil that swept Europe during the Second World War, Noor's life had all the earmarks of once upon a timing. And how happy and idyllic were Noor's early years. Next slide. The next slide has Noor's family. There it is, Noor's family's home opposite Paris. This is called Fazl Manzil, the House of Blessings. And as I said a moment ago, it's almost a castle. I've been there several times, outside and inside. Next slide. This is the field that was across the street from Fazl Manzil. Upper left-hand corner of that photo, you can see the house itself. You get a sense of the expanse of that field. There's Noor's father in the road. There's Noor's mother sitting down. And next slide, this is where Noor and her siblings would also play. And there's Noor, the left-hand corner of that photo. And all these, by the way, are a marked contrast to the Paris of the 1920s that was right across the river. Paris that we usually associate with expatriates and artistic ferment and hedonism and folks just having a really good time. Meanwhile, of course, there's this little girl, a happy girl on the left, who's playing some kind of circle game with her three siblings. She had no idea what lay in her future. Nobody knew what lay in her future. Noor's American mother, her Indian father, her Russian birth, her French and British upbringing made her American, Indian, Russian, British, French, as united a blend of nations as could be found in just about any one individual. And somehow, Noor held all that together, integrating all those nations and cultures and traditions into a distinct personality, transmuting herself eventually into one of the most unlikely secret agents of World War II. Unlikely because Noor was as ethereal an agent as any side fielded during the war. Thanks to her father, a Sufi master, Noor practiced a very sensible, non-transcendental mysticism. To become an angel is not very difficult, her father taught. To live in the world, in all the difficulties, all the struggles of the world, to be human at the same time, that, he said, is very difficult. If we become that, he continued, then we become the miniature of God on earth. For Noor, for her father, spirituality did not reside in another realm. Spirituality was here, it was now, and it was very real because the world is very real. Noor grew into a deceptively strong-willed young woman. Next slide. She wrote music. Here she is in her mid-20s. She wrote music, poetry, children's short stories, essays about faith and religion, and she always put others before herself. Service, in fact, was a keystone of Noor's faith. For her, and these are her words right now, the essence of spirituality and mysticism is readiness to serve the person next to us. Noor's mysticism did not renounce the world. It embraced it with all its messiness, all its triumphs, all its pleasures and all its joys, all its disappointments and all its triumphs. Everything was grist for Noor's mill, and everything she absorbed and interpreted through her rare and unique prism. So when the time came to serve during the war, Noor was ready to become the most improbable agent in Britain's top secret agency, the Special Operations Executive. You may know it better as the SOE. Noor was improbable because she was diminutive, 5'4", barely 100 pounds, about as slight as it comes. Improbable because the SOE did not habitually recruit shy, quiet, introspective mystics. And even more improbable because it didn't usually send on missions agents whose trainers said they were, quote, not overburdened with brains. That's what one of Noor's handlers in the SOE said about her. This guy, by the way, just didn't like the idea of women doing, quote, men's work, espionage, sabotage, working behind enemy lines. And despite that, on June 16th, 1943, 79 years ago today, Noor was the first female radio operator the SOE flew into France, holding the Gestapo at bay for months while lugging around this device that Amanda just referred to, her 30-pound radio. And Amanda, if you could show us that next photo. And in the exhibit at the museum, they have a type of a replica of this. I've been there, I've tried to pick it up. To me, this felt more than 30 pounds. Poor Noor, I'm sorry.
I will say we certainly have Virginia Hall's radio. We have similar models, but right nearby, but the replica that you can try out, most people find out it's way heavier than they expected.
Yeah, and this was disguised by the SOE as a suitcase. You can see the handle there, the locks on the front. And often Noor would carry this with her in Paris after she landed June 16th, 1943. And these were the days before suitcases were on wheels. She had to carry the full load of these 30 pounds. Wherever she went, though, she never varied from the ethical principles of Sufism that she had learned from her father. And when she was finally caught, Noor told the Germans nothing, and she won their respect even after trying to escape twice from a Gestapo prison in the center of Paris. The next photo, please. Okay, this is 84 Avenue Foch in Paris itself. This is where Noor was taken after the Gestapo caught her mid-October 43. She was questioned way up on the 5th floor for, let's say, 2-3 hours. It became apparent to the Gestapo agents they were not going to get anything out of this young woman. So they began to lead her down the hallway to her cell. She said, no, I really would rather go to the ladies' room first. Where is it? So they pointed to a room at the end of that corridor. Noor went in there. She began to close the door. An agent came over. She said, no. We always keep a brick in the door to see what prisoners are doing in this loo or restroom. Noor insisted. She was very adamant. She was very, very persuasive. They took the brick away. They closed the door. Noor was in there for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 minutes. They began to wonder whatever happened to that new prisoner we just brought in. Another agent then opened up a window just a little bit further down on that 5th floor from where the restroom and looked out. And he saw Noor balancing on that rain gutter, which you can see going from left to right, just under those windows at the top level of that building. He panicked. He did not want Noor to fall from 5 floors up. He very quietly said, Noor, please come in. You do not want to fall. You do not want to look down, and you do not want your mother to learn this is how you died. He knew that Noor was extremely close to her mother. Noor came back in. They took her to her cell. She spent a good part of that night crying and thinking to herself, if I can't escape from this building, what good am I to the Allied cause? That was October 43. Let's jump to the near the end of the next month, November. In fact, it was Thanksgiving here. It was late that evening, excuse me, in Paris when Noor and 2 other fellows went up. Noor was trying to go over the first escape and then up. Second time, she and the other guys went straight up through skylights in their cells and then through makeshift ropes that they made from blankets and sheets. They went down and then from one balcony of nearby building to another. She was caught. They were caught almost instantly. Noor was taken to a prison in Germany the next day. She was locked up in solitary and shackled, wrist to wrist, ankle to ankle, those 2 sets of chains chained to each other so Noor could barely stand. 10 months later, Noor was taken by train to Dachau. The next day, in a shallow pit about 100 feet from Dachau's crematorium, she was executed with a bullet to her head. Next slide. Noor served willingly and wholeheartedly, with a bravery and a spiritual perspective that were uncommon throughout the war, throughout any war. Noor's perspective, in fact, confounded a friend of mine, a psychologist. He insisted that Noor had a death wish, an irrational impulse to extinguish herself. I told my friend there was nothing irrational about what Noor did. Yes, she knew that radio operators were the linchpin of the SOE, and without them, the SOE could not have communicated with the agents it smuggled into Europe, coordinating activities, planning strategy, dropping supplies and money, And Noor knew that the average lifespan of a operator in France was 6 weeks. Noor, by the way, lasted 4 months, not 6 weeks. But she believed, to quote Noor, that sacrificing yourself for others bathes the world in a love which purifies and heals the suffering of humanity. Bathes the world in love. This was not how undercover agents usually talked. Noor's goal was not to eliminate herself, as my psychologist friend said. Her goal was to heal the world, to ease its suffering, to make it better. Noor did not have a death wish, nor had a life wish. While researching Codename Madeleine, I was struck by a phrase Noor wrote when she was in her mid-20s. The heart must be broken for the real to come forth. World War II broke Noor's heart, and the real came forth. In a world torn apart, Noor found her destiny and she found her calling. That's why hers is a story of courage, faith, resilience, a story that inspired those who knew her, and a story that can inspire us now in our own chaotic, turbulent, and troubling age. Among the many treats, thank you. I was about to say next slide. Among the many treats of writing this book was discovering extraordinary stories wherever I looked, stories that had never been told before. A few examples. Here's Noor as a little girl, because I found Noor's report cards untapped before by anybody. I discovered that her talent for writing and for storytelling was noticed as early as kindergarten. That's when Noor's teacher praised her for how well she, quote, listens and enjoys stories and can tell one herself. Other than that, Noor had some of the same faults as all the rest of us, especially in kindergarten. She was too talkative. She was a real chatterbox. She had difficulty concentrating. Her mind, one teacher complained, needed steadying and strengthening. As her life went on, Noor more than made up for this. Without a steady, strong mind, the Gestapo would have caught Noor days after she arrived in Paris, not months. I also learned that in 1940, Noor and her mother and two siblings fled from the Germans in her brother's MG. But how? How, I kept thinking, how was that possible? As far as I knew, and I know a fair amount about MGs, I love old sport cars. I love new sports cars. I have one. As far as I knew, MGs had room for two passengers, not four. Let's go to the next photo. That's the type of MG, not the MG, but the type that Noor and her siblings and mother fled to the coast in. After tracking down the head of the MG Car Club Limited in England, I learned that MG had produced models with jump seats between 1922 and 1933. After more digging, I learned that Noor's mother sat in the front passenger seat. Noor's brother Elia drove, and Noor and her sister sat behind them in the jump seat. In my book, I say the MG was, quote from me, a great car for a jolly picnic in the country, not for fleeing from the Nazis. MGs were made for rallies and for flirting with girls in Piccadilly or at Ascot. They weren't intended for joining a long line of refugees while the Germans strafed them from the air. Soon after leaving Suresnes, where the family lived across from Paris, Noor's brother turned the car onto roads filled with broken down cars and broken down people. Next photo. With infantrymen humiliated by their rout, dead horses lying in ditches, Farm wagons piled high with tables, suitcases. Next photo. There was a man carrying a cat. Here we have people on one of the roads that quite probably Noor and her family traveled. There was a man carrying a cat, a woman carrying a bird in a cage, mothers pushing babies in prams, children carrying toys, dolls, blankies, and everywhere mattresses were lashed to the tops of Renaults and Citroens and Mercedes. On the top of one car, the body of a grandmother who died en route was tied to a mattress because her son could not bear to leave her alongside the road. Leaving the MG and tours with a friend, the Khans found seats on a train. The train, Noor wrote, was noisy and crowded with frantic young mothers with tear-stained eyes carrying their sleeping youngsters. They knew not nor said where they were heading. They were just running toward freedom, if freedom was to found. For the little ones, Noor wrote, France should be saved from enemy hands at any price. I have wiped the eyes of some, given water to others. Thank you, Noor, for doing that. I'm convinced that sitting in the jump seat of that MG while passing thousands of refugees and looking at them directly in the eye, one after another, and wiping the eyes of those children on the train, all that strengthened the pledge that Noor had made to herself and to her brother. Somehow she would return to France to fight the Germans. I also learned that a few weeks after the SOE flew Noor into France in June 43, she knocked on neighbors' doors in the village where she'd lived before the war, hoping someone would let her send messages to England from their home. She didn't know she was surrounded by Germans. In a massive 19th century fort, just a few blocks away, a fort where Noor's brother and sister had played as children, the Germans were executing members of the resistance. Next slide, Amanda, thank you. And that August in 1943, when Noor was begging neighbors to let her use her radio from their homes, Joseph Axelrod was executed in that fort, and Marcel Cugnan and Jules Godfrey and Jules Gian and Michel Legois and more. The next month, Abel Blanchard and Marcel Bernard and more were killed. By the end of the war, almost 1,200 Frenchmen would be killed in that fort and on that spot you see in that photo. Noor also didn't know that every time she returned to the home that did let her transmit messages to England on her 30-pound radio, she walked through a gauntlet of Germans. 33 Gestapo agents were living on that same block. 28 were living in Noor's family's home right around the corner. More were living in 17 other homes a block away. Wherever Noor walked, there were Germans. But what, and this is really important, what for Noor did fighting the Germans mean? Fighting meant never forgetting she was a Sufi, never forgetting the rules of chivalry that her father had laid down when Noor was 12. Next slide, Amanda, thank you. These rules emphasize modesty, humility, empathy, and discipline. A few examples: do not neglect those who depend upon you. Bear no malice against your worst enemy. That one totally befuddles me when you consider who Noor's worst enemy was. Bear no malice. Hold your head high in all circumstances. This was a knighthood of conscience and spirit and courage, persistence, dignity. And that's why Noor's story is so compelling. Not once did she deviate or stray from what she had learned from her father. and not once did she stray or abandon her principles, which I believe you just heard were extremely high and notable principles. Nor in many ways was ideal for the SOA. She knew French. She knew France. She certainly knew Paris. She was brave, braver than she seemed when the SOE first recruited her. But to be a good agent, Nor was put in the position of possibly bending one of her father's cardinal principles: never lie. Her father taught, truth is all the religion there is. True religion, he said, is the sea of truth. Maybe, but undercover agents can't be truthful. Without deceit, without guile, an agent was a dud, probably a dead dud. And yet, not once did Noor lie while she was serving as an SOE agent. The SOE flew Noor into France anyway on the night of June 16th, 1943. Next slide. And what do we know of that night, of that flight, of Noor on it? In my book, I wrote, there was a full moon that night. There had to be. That was the only way to fly. The pilot of the lightweight plane that was taking Noor to France used no lights, not even a flashlight, to help him scan the crumpled up map that rested on his knee. Stripped to meet weight and space restrictions, Frank Reimel's Lysander carried no guns, no armor, no navigation equipment, but everything the Lysander, which indeed is this plane on the screen, everything that plane lacked gave Reimel's a major advantage over the Germans. If his radio on, the Nazis were listening. They knew he was up there, but they didn't know where. It was a big sky, and being unable to determine his location was a major boost. So along the way, as they were coming into France, Limels said to Noor, Madame, we are approaching your beautiful country. And Noor said through this intercom that linked her with Rimels, isn't it lovely in the moonlight? Next slide. Oh, it is heavenly, Noor shouted. What, she inquired, is that town over there, pointing to the sort of view she'd heard from poets and dreamers, but had never expected to enjoy herself. And these photos, by the way, I took at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum near Dulles Airport. You get a sense of how tiny these planes were. For the next 30 minutes while Nora's flying in this plane with Frank Reimels as her pilot, Reimels shouted over the roar of his engine about the landmarks below, chateaus, towns that were treasures of history and architecture. If Reimels had been flying higher, the gleam of Paris would have been visible. But Paris was dark, Reimels was flying low, and Nora was happy just to be returning home. Within a week after Noor landed, the Germans caught almost everyone in Noor's cell. She was essentially on her own now. And that's when her real adventure began. When she really began to understand the dangers she faced and also the possible sacrifice that she was about to make. Noor, in fact, had dwelled on the notion of sacrifice many times in her life. She called the concept of sacrifice a joy. And the greatest sacrifice, she wrote, was the sacrifice of one's self. That, she said, was the best and the truest and the finest sacrifice was to sacrifice yourself for humanity. I also wrote that Noor's father had urged her to look at humanity without thinking they're German or English or French. They are all, he wrote, equally dear to the enlightened soul. To these souls, Judgment Day does not come after death. For that soul, every day is a judgment day. Without thinking that German or English or French deserves repetition, nor made no distinction between these. She wasn't fighting against the Germans. She wasn't fighting for the English, for the French. She was fighting for humanity. In Paris, Noor built new cells. She ensured that money and arms kept flowing to the resistance. She sent messages to London about German troop movements, which factories and airports should be bombed, about the frequencies the Germans were using to communicate with their submarines, and more. One of her messages was indispensable to D-Day. She asked London to send a plane to pick up two French agents. They had a map of German defenses of Brittany. 2 weeks before D-Day, Free French paratroopers jumped into Brittany. They teamed up with the resistance, dynamited petrol dumps, destroyed most of the Nazis' communication network in that region. And this slowed down German troops desperate to get to Normandy on D-Day and stop the Allied soldiers who were pouring into France. Noor's contribution to victory were indispensable, and sadly, they are largely unknown. I understand we're a little bit tight on time, so I want to jump ahead just a little bit. And that's why, Amanda, I'm going to ask you to jump ahead just a little bit also um, with some of these slides. Let's go to the next one. The next one, okay, the next one after that, if you will. And after that, okay, let's hold it there. Researching this book, codenamed Madeleine, took me to France, Germany, England, to archives, churches, convents, to a death camp, Dachau, to Sufi retreats, to elementary schools where students had done lengthy projects on Noor, to the town where Noor lived before the war, and where there's now a street and a school named after her. And several times I visited Noor's family's home. And here you see what's called the Oriental Room in Noor's home, Basil Manzo. And this is where Noor and her brother had that pivotal discussion in June 43, as the Germans were pouring in. In fact, they had taken over part of this village, and Noor and her brother were trying to figure out what to do next. Stay here, stay in Suren, or somehow get to the coast. In that MG, they got to the coast. Everywhere I went, people were eager to talk about Noor. And everywhere I went, I just had wonderful conversations with people. There was a third grader. Let's move ahead. Another photo, please. I'm sorry. There was a third grader. Thank you, Noor. There's Noor playing her vina, which is like a sitar. There was a third grader in a school in Suren, just a couple blocks away, in fact, from Noor's family's home. About 5-6 years ago, the school was named after Noor. And rounding up the end of this hour-long interview I did with the entire class, I asked the whole group, you know, what had they learned from Noor? Here's a school named after Noor. There's a little bust of her in the lobby. And there was a little boy right in front of me, just waving his hand. I could not ignore him. So I asked him, okay, what did you learn from Noor? I learned from Noor, he said, that we should always help other people. If my little sister falls into a hole, I'll pull her out. That is exactly what Noor taught. Help anybody, anywhere, in any circumstance, even if they fall into a hole, and especially if they're
even if you're your little sister. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say in my ad lib as well, but you beat me to a good ad lib. I also interviewed the Mother Superior of the convent at Dachau, and during our interview, I glanced at the crucifix that was hanging on the wall right next to us, and I said to Sister Ermengarde, I'm sure you pray to Jesus, and maybe for Jesus. Do you pray for Noor? Sister Ermengarde said, no, I pray with Noor. That's the effect she has on people. Rounding up now, I also interviewed Mary, Noor's 88-year-old sister-in-law. And what I asked Mary was in Noor's nature that led her from believing in fairies, writing numerous poems about them, all the way into her teens, to resisting the Nazis, then trying to escape twice from a heavily guarded prison in Paris. And Mary paused for a moment, looked directly into my eyes, and said, Noor always believed in the unbelievable. And that may be the ultimate lesson from Noor. We should always believe in the unbelievable, in the far-fetched and the good, in our incredible capacity for courage, in our unquenched quest for truth, for wisdom, and ourselves. For we are more than what we seem, and the world is more than what we see. And even the most unlikely of us, like Noor, can make the most improbable of differences in the short amount of time allotted to us on Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. It's really been amazing to take such a dive into Noor's psyche, and we've had a wide variety of questions coming in. So we'll use our time wisely, but I am dying to know, how did you come to learn about Noor? How did she come across your wavelength?
She she invaded my wavelength. Maybe from her perspective, intentionally. From my perspective, totally accidentally. Going back September, probably 2012, 2013, I received an email from friends who make documentary films, and basically they were telling me about their new film that was shortly going to be on PBS. It's called Enemy of the Reich. I recommend it. I'm reading what they sent me. First paragraph mentioned Noor Inayat Khan. I had no idea who this woman was. It mentioned the SOE, Special Operations Executive. I'd never heard of that before either. Second paragraph mentioned Noor's father, Hazrat Inayat Khan, the Sufi master I mentioned. I had heard of, because over the course of my life, I've been engaged with a lot of different spiritualities. And I had read Hazrat Inayat Khan. For his daughter to have been a secret agent in Paris during the war was so improbable, so crazy, so insane. Also, so probable, even though I said a moment ago, improbable, because I knew he taught that to serve in life was our highest calling, and that's exactly what Noor did. So I got the notion of doing a book on Noor Inayat Khan. I researched the heck out of it for the proposal. And along the way, I emailed Noor's nephew, who was then living in upstate New York, requested an interview. He granted an interview, let's say for about a month after the initial request. About a week before I went up there, I emailed him, how do you account for Noor's spiritually surviving her 10 months in solitary and in chains in that prison in Germany? And he sent me a verse from the Bhagavad Gita about selflessness. And it was a good translation, but I reached over to my shelf. I pulled out my own Bhagavad Gita. I never go anywhere without my Bhagavad Gita, and flipped through it, found the verse. What was very odd was that I had not opened my Gita for, let's say, 20, 30 years. 20, 30 years ago, I had put brackets around one verse, and it was the verse that Zia told me had helped sustain Noor while she was in that prison. So I took this with me. Upstate New York, halfway through the interview, I pulled it out of my backpack, found the page, thought Perzia would get a kick out of it. And then I noticed what I hadn't noticed here, that 30 years or so, not only had I put brackets around it, I had written in pencil, karma yoga, which is selfless action for others, which is what Noor did and what this verse is about. Karma yoga equals freedom. Then I handed it to Perzia, and he just about shrugged and said, well, of course you wrote that. Of course you wrote freedom, because Noor's last word at Dachau, just before she was executed, was freedom. That's how I learned about it.
And how did she say it?
Well, in French, liberté,
That was one of the
I
questions we had,
yeah.
actually, and so you've answered it.
Okay. If the question is about how in detail did Noor die at Dachau, I actually unearthed 4 different accounts, and one of them says yes, she died while holding the hand of another female agent in a shallow ditch. I've been to that ditch, in fact, and her last word was liberté. It's possible she said that, and it's possible also she was taken to the camp the night of September 12th, maybe killed then. Maybe she spent the night in a prison, a cell at Dachau, and then taken to that shallow ditch. The details are fuzzy. What is not fuzzy is that she was executed and that her body was placed into a crematorium at Dachau.
Arthur, I'm seeing someone ask if you would say the chapter and verse that you quoted.
Oh, certainly. I should know this by heart by now. Phooey. Pardon my language. Okay, Bhagavad Gita. For those versed in the Bhagavad Gita, here is the verse. Okay, Bhagavad Gita 4:14 through, let's say, 23. 4:14 through 23. Starts out, in the bonds of work, I am free, because in them I am free from desires. The man who can see this truth, in his work, he finds his freedom. Basically, it says, if you are not attached to the fruits of your labors, Noor's labors in France as an SOE agent, nor laboring extensively while she was in that horrible prison in Germany, if you are not attached to that, you are free. And Noor, I believe, as difficult as it is to imagine this, was free all the time she served at the SOE in Paris.
Someone wants to know about a movie I'm sure you have seen, and we may both have opinions on it. I will share mine. Is Noor the person in A Call to Spy? Have you seen the film?
No.
Me?
Start.
Hey, guess what, Arthur? Me either. Me neither.
Okay, I want to hear why you haven't, and then I'll tell you why I haven't.
Because I don't like the history mashup. I feel like but it is supposed to be Noor. But my feelings are we don't need to conflate all these historical figures together to make a movie when any of these women could have been an amazing movie with the story told properly. Over to you, Arthur.
Thank you. And I agree with you on the mashup. I mean, is Hamilton really about Hamilton? I don't know. I haven't seen that either, but I want to. If anybody out there in Zoom land wants to treat me to a ticket to Hamilton, I'll take you up on it. I haven't seen Call to Spy for several reasons. One, I don't like the mashup. 2, I read several reviews, didn't like what I read, won't say why. I'm trying to be respectful of somebody's creation. And from what I understand, it was a creation. Yeah. 3, I know maybe 4 or 5 people who have seen it. They know a lot about the Norse story, and they did not advise me to see it. And frankly, I'm so maybe rigidly attached to my version of Noor. I don't want to see anybody else's version. And perhaps fifth, I've lost count by now. My book, codename Madeleine, has been optioned for a film. The option, it was optioned for 18 months. That option has been renewed. They're now working on getting a screenwriter. So I just don't want my sights contaminated by somebody else's vision of Noor.
All right, we're going to ask you two really quick questions because we're running out of time. Easy one. How many languages did she speak?
Oh, geez. I thought easy ones would be like yes and no, and we're done. Um, no, okay. Um, English. Actually, most of her writings, by the way, were in English and made it
Oh,
so much easier for me. English, French. She didn't know any German, even though she was caught by Germans. Primarily English, French.
did she
Yeah.
did she speak any languages from her father's background?
No, not as far as I know. And also, it's my impression, and that's all it is that her father was extraordinarily fluent in English, both orally and in writing. I have his original writings in his penmanship, which is better than mine. Those were in English, as I said, I believe a moment ago. Noor's writings mostly were in English. I had to have some that were in French translated, but as far as I know, and off the top of my head, she spoke only English and French.
All right, and last question, because you've alluded to speaking to her sister-in-law, what happened to her family? I think people will be very intrigued by that.
Okay, thank you. And I should have addressed that. I said before that, Noor, mother, two siblings. Um, were able to get to the coast in that wonderful MG. And boy, the family wishes they had kept that MG. I wish they kept it. I want to go for a ride in the jump seat.
Me too,
Um,
me too.
okay, Noor's mother, Aura, died 47, 48. Noor's sister, Claire, who was in that MG, served as sort of a medical technician in England during the war. She eventually emigrated to the US, died sometime in the early 2000s. Noor's brother, Vilayat, served in the Royal Navy during the war, and eventually he became a very influential Sufi leader and teacher in Europe as well as in the United States. He founded a Sufi retreat center in New Lebanon, New York, where totally accidentally, before I ever learned about Noor, I visited quite some time ago. And Vilayat died about 2007, 2008. There was a brother, Hidayat, who was not in that MG because he had a wife and I believe one or two children. He got into a car outside Faz-el-Manzil and went down to southern France, spent the war there. After the war settled in The Hague, died, let's say 15 years ago. There are two nephews still alive. One, David, lives in southeastern Germany. Here's Zia, the one who sent me the verse in the Bhagavad Gita, now lives in Richmond. And and her wonderful, wonderful cousin, Mahmoud, is now 90 and lives in The Hague. And I had delightful conversations with him.
Well, Arthur, that is a great place to stop, knowing that her family continues on with and with they keep her memory alive. I know that, and we really appreciate having you share in such a meaningful and thoughtful way a little bit more about this amazing young woman. Who's so special to all of us. So thank you, Arthur. We're looking forward to, everyone's looking forward to seeing your movie. We all know it's gonna really show us what's right. I'm looking forward to doing other things with you. Someday we will meet in person. but we're moving along today. And this is crazy. Our next program is tomorrow at noon. It couldn't be more different because it's about Watergate, where there is, I'm going to be awful and say where there's no one who has a heart and soul as serene and pure and wonderful as Noor. But please join us. It'll be very different, but very interesting. And if you love our programs, please do consider making a contribution. Our donors like you keep us going all year long. And last but not least, we have the wonderful book. We have Arthur's wonderful book for sale in the store. It's also available in other places. But when we send our thank you out to you for attending today, we will include Arthur's email because he will send you a book plate for your book if you write him. And that is so generous of you, Arthur, for sharing your email and sharing your thoughts. And this has been an incredible pleasure.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed myself.
Stay well, everybody. Have a great day.